Hey guys! Tonight, before we say a single word about prairies or log cabins or pioneer winters, I want you to picture something simple. Picture a family photograph, not a famous one, just an ordinary image, the kind where someone is standing slightly off-centre, half in shadow, almost out of frame, the kind where you look at it for a full minute and then realise there are actually 4 people in it, not 3. That 4th figure, the small one, the quiet one, the one your eye kept skipping over, that is Carrie Ingalls. And tonight, we're going to stop skipping her. Most people who grew up reading Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House books know Carrie the way you know a piece of furniture you have walked past 1,000 times. She is there. She's always been there. But you cannot quite describe her without going back to check. Mary was the beautiful one. The one who went blind. The one who broke your heart in ways you still remember decades later. Laura was the voice. The brave one. The restless one. The one who grew up and wrote everything down. Grace was the baby, the golden one, who arrived at the end. The sweetness that came when the family finally stopped moving quite so much. And Carrie? Carrie was the one in the middle, small, thin, frail. That word, that careful, loaded word that history reached for again and again when it needed to describe her. Frail. Tonight, we are going to take that word apart very slowly. Because it turns out there is a difference. A crucial, historically documented difference between being frail and being weak. And the story of Carrie Ingalls is the story of what happens when history mistakes one for the other and simply moves on. Her full name was Carolyn Celestia Ingalls. She was born on August 3rd, 1870 in Montgomery County, Kansas, right in the middle of the events that Laura would later write about in Little House on the Prairie. Think about that for a moment. Carrie was not just a character in those books. She was born inside the story. While Pa was still hammering together the walls of that Kansas cabin, while Ma was still organising the tiny household against the prairie wind, Carrie arrived. 3rd child. New lungs in a house that was already straining under the weight of frontier life. She came into a world that did not give frail children many advantages. The Kansas prairie in 1870 was not gentle. It was not the golden, sun-warmed landscape of children's book illustrations. It was exposed grassland in the middle of a continent with temperature swings that could knock a grown man sideways, dust so fine it worked its way into every crack in the cabin walls, and medical help that was never close enough to feel safe. When a child later described as small, thin and frail grew up on that kind of ground, the odds were never quietly in her favour. And yet, here is the first thing you need to understand about Carrie Ingalls. She survived it. She was frail. She was not weak. Say it once. Sit with it. We will come back to that sentence again, and each time we do, it will mean something a little heavier than it did before. Now, before we go any further, I want to be honest with you about something, because this documentary is not going to work unless you trust it. The Little House books are beloved. They are genuinely, historically important pieces of American literature. They gave generations of readers, mostly girls, mostly women, a story about endurance and family love, and the beauty of a life built with your own hands. That is real. That matters. Laura Ingalls. Wilder was a gifted writer, and the world she put on the page had genuine warmth and truth in it. But a family story told by one member of that family is not a complete history. Laura wrote the books. Laura chose what stayed and what went. Laura was the narrator, the heroine, the sensibility through which everything was filtered. And when you are the one holding the pen, you do not always realise how much smaller you are making the people standing just behind you. Carrie was not pushed out of the story with any malice. She was not deliberately minimised, but she was left underdeveloped in a way that had real consequences, not just for how readers remembered her, but for how history remembered her. When people ask who Carrie Ingalls was, there is a pause, a search, a half-remembered detail. She was the frail one, right? The thin one. She was there. Yes, she was there. She was there for every move the Ingalls family made across several states. She was there through the long winter of 1880 to 1881, the winter that nearly killed all of them. She was there when Mary went blind, watching her older sister's world go dark while her own kept going. She grew up, left home, worked, built an adult life in South Dakota, married, helped raise a stepfamily and died at 75 years old in a hospital in Rapid City, South Dakota on June the 2nd, 1946. That is a full life, a hard life, a life that deserved far more than a recurring description of thinness. So why does she feel like a footnote? That is the question this documentary is here to answer. Not by inventing drama, not by manufacturing some secret rivalry between sisters, not by rewriting Laura's books into something darker than they were, but by sitting down with what the historical record actually says about Caroline Celestia Ingalls, the girl who was born frail, grew up in some of the harshest conditions the 19th century American frontier could produce, and lived a longer, richer, more complicated life than the books ever quite showed you. If you are new here, welcome. Hit subscribe right now. If these quieter lives matter to you, stay with us. Carrie's story is only beginning. Let us start at the very beginning, not with Carrie, but with the world she was born into. Because you cannot understand what frailty meant on the American frontier without first understanding what the frontier cost a family that had almost nothing to fall back on. The Ingalls family were movers. That is a documented pattern, not a criticism, that shaped every single thing about Carrie's childhood. Charles Ingalls, whom Laura made legendary as Pa, had a genuine restlessness that biographers have noted repeatedly. He believed in new starts. He believed in the horizon. He had the kind of faith that tells a man the next piece of land will be the one that finally works. The problem with that kind of faith, and again, this is a practical observation, not a moral verdict, is that it is expensive. Every move costs money that a struggling frontier family does not have sitting in a jar. Every abandoned claim is a loss that cannot be recovered. Every new start begins at zero again, or sometimes below zero, with debt trailing behind like a long shadow. By the time Carrie was born in that Kansas cabin in 1870, her family had already relocated significantly and would keep moving for years to come. Kansas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Dakota Territory. Each location was another chapter of the same story. Arrive, plant, try, fail, or barely survive, then move again. And through all of it, Carrie was small and thin and prone to illness in ways the Prairie absolutely did not accommodate. Here is something Laura's books never put into plain language, but the historical record does not hide. Carrie Ingalls had serious recurring health problems throughout her life. She suffered from throat ailments, hay fever, and asthma severe enough that in December of 1905, when she was 35 years old, she travelled from Smet all the way to Boulder, Colorado, specifically seeking a climate that would give her respiratory system some relief. She also travelled to Wyoming for the same reason. Think about what it took for a woman in her 30s in 1905 to pick up and move to an entirely different state chasing breathable air. That is not a casual decision. That is a woman who had spent decades fighting her own body on top of everything else the frontier demanded of her, and had finally decided to do something deliberate about it. That is not weakness. That is strategy. But here is what the books show you of Carrie instead. A small child, occasionally tired, occasionally ill, always slightly behind Mary and Laura in stamina and narrative importance. Frail. There is a kind of ledger that every biography keeps, even when it does not call itself one. On one side, the things a person did, decided, survived, and built. On the other side, the things history chose to remember about them. For most people, those two columns balance reasonably well. For the people who are never the main character of someone else's famous story, the ledger is lopsided before it even opens. Carrie Ingalls entered the historical record on the wrong side of that ledger. She was recorded as the frail one, the quiet one, the Ingalls daughter, who was not Mary and was not Laura and was not Grace. She was defined by what she was not before history got around to asking what she was. But here is what the left column of that ledger actually contains, when you take the time to fill it in honestly. A woman who survived a frontier childhood that broke many healthier bodies than hers. A woman who worked as a typesetter and newspaper worker in South Dakota. Skilled, careful labour that demanded steady hands and long hours. A woman who moved for her health, built an adult life beyond Smet, married a widower named David Swansea in 1912, helped raise his 2 children, and carried family responsibilities long after the books left her small. A woman who lived to 75, longer than Pa, longer than Mary, and longer than Grace, though not longer than Ma or Laura. The right column says, frail. The left column says, she outlasted almost everyone. That is the contradiction at the centre of Carrie Ingalls' life. She was the one the story consistently described as unlikely to hold up. and she was the one who held up the longest. History tends to do this to the people it does not quite know what to do with. It picks one word, frail, quiet, difficult, odd, and it uses that word as a lid, pressing it down over everything else until the everything else disappears. The word is not always wrong. Carrie was genuinely small, genuinely prone to illness, genuinely less physically robust than her sisters. But the word became a verdict instead of a description, and verdicts are much harder to appeal than descriptions. Here is something to hold in the back of your mind as we move through Carrie's story together. We will return to it, I promise. When Almanzo Wilder, the man who would eventually marry Laura, was growing up in northern New York, his family's farm was substantial, documented. The barn was large, the granary held through winter. There were horses, good land, and a family plugged into the rhythms of an established agricultural community with access to markets, credit, and neighbours who had been farming the same soil for generations. When Carrie Ingalls was growing up, born the same decade, a few states away, the Ingalls family's pantry was a different kind of story, a thin one. The kind of story where a bad harvest or a hard winter does not just mean hardship, it means hunger. It means the question of whether there will be enough is a question that hangs in the air of the house from October through April. Two families, one frontier myth, one pantry that held, and one that did not always. We will come back to the barn. We will come back to the cellar. By the time this documentary is finished, you will understand exactly why that difference matters. Not just for Laura and Almanzo's story, but for Carrie's. Tonight, we have only just opened the ledger. We know her name. We know when she was born and where, and we know the first word history reached for when it tried to describe her. We know that word is not wrong, and we know, because the dates do not lie, that it is not the whole story either. Frail, yes, not weak. In the next chapter, we are going to follow this family across the map, Kansas to Wisconsin to Minnesota to Dakota territory, and we are going to do something the Little House books never quite did. We are going to count the cost of all that moving, the money spent and the money lost, the claims filed and the claims abandoned, the harvests that came in and the ones that did not. We are going to sit down with the practical reality of what it meant to be an Ingalls on the American frontier, and we're going to understand for the first time exactly what kind of world Carrie Ingalls was fighting to survive in. Because before you can understand how hard her life was, you have to understand how thin the margin was, and the Ingalls margin was always thin. Picture a trunk being closed for the third time in 5 years. Not packed slowly, the way you pack for a trip you're looking forward to. Packed fast. The kind of packing that means you're leaving before you have fully arrived. Leaving behind what will not fit. Leaving behind the idea that this place was going to be different. Ma folds the quilts, Pa loads the wagon, and Carrie, somewhere between toddler and small child, depending on which move this is, watches another home get folded up and put away. That is how her childhood began, not with a single hard thing, with motion that never quite stopped. The Ingalls family moved from Kansas back to Wisconsin in 1871. Carrie was barely 1 year old. Then, in the fall of 1873, Pa sold the Wisconsin land for $1,000, a transaction recorded in the deed books, and pointed the wagon west again, toward Minnesota. By May 1874, they had settled just north of the tiny community of Walnut Grove, on a piece of ground along Plum Creek in Redwood County. Pa filed a preemption claim on June 26th of that year. The family dug into the bank of the creek and lived in a dugout and a hole in the earth with a roof over it, while Pa built something better on credit, counting on the wheat crop to pay the debt. Carrie was 3 years old. A move is a decision for a father. For a child, it is a disappearance. The Plum Creek land was genuinely promising. Rich Minnesota soil, a creek, and the kind of optimism that looks entirely reasonable before disaster arrives. The first summer brought a good crop. Then 1874 happened. The Rocky Mountain locust, Melanoplus spretus, a species now extinct, which in its final generations descended on the Great Plains in swarms so large they blocked out the sun. In 1875, Dr. A. L. Child estimated one swarm at 1,800 miles long and 110 miles wide. Entomologist Geoffrey Lockwood later calculated the full population at approximately 3.5 trillion insects. They ate the wheat in hours. They ate the wool off live sheep. They ate wooden tool handles for the salt from human sweat. They made the railroad tracks so slippery with their bodies that trains could not move, and they ate the Ingalls crop completely, 2 years in a row. Here are what 2 consecutive crop failures meant in practical terms for a family living on a preemption claim with no savings. Pa had to walk 300 miles east to find harvest work on other farms just to earn enough to feed his family through winter. 300 miles on foot, because there was no other way. While Ma stayed at Plum Creek with 3 girls, Mary, Laura and Carrie, now 4 years old, managing winter on whatever they had, which was not much. The thing about a thin margin is that it does not take a catastrophe to break it. It only takes 2 bad years in a row. Carrie would not have understood the deed books or the crop calculations, but she would have understood the feeling inside the house when food became a question. The quieter voices, the stretched meals, the way grown-ups tried to make fear look ordinary. And here is the detail that the Little House book softened without erasing completely. The Ingalls family did not triumph over the locust years. They endured them, and then they left. In July 1876, Charles Ingalls paid $450 to officially purchase the Plum Creek land and sold it 3 days later. He sold it for a loss. On July 7th, they paid for the land. On July 10th, it belonged to someone else. That sequence, that 3-day gap between buying and selling, is the entire story of what happened at Plum Creek. They bought it to sell it because they needed to leave and needed the money to do it. What did leaving cost this time? The wheat they had expected to grow, the house Pa had built above the dugout, the school the girls had briefly attended, the neighbours they had started to know. The idea that Walnut Grove was going to be the place. It was not going to be the place. Home was not a place yet. It was a hope. Where they went next is the chapter of Ingalls family history that most readers of the Little House books have never encountered. Not because it was hidden, but because Laura never wrote about it. In 1876, the family moved to Burr Oak, Iowa, a small town in northeastern Iowa where Charles Ingalls went to help a couple named Stedman operate the Masters Hotel. Pa, who had spent years trying to make land produce, was now working as a hotel manager. The family lived inside the hotel building itself. The book skipped this period entirely. Laura called Burr Oak the missing link in her own memory of childhood, and the gap was deliberate. She chose not to include those years in the Little House series. Many readers and biographers treat the Burr Oak years as too awkward, too painful, or too tonally difficult to fit naturally inside the published Little House arc. What happened in Burr Oak? The hotel work was hard and the town was not what the family had hoped. Their baby son, Charles Frederick, born in 1875, the only Ingalls boy, died at 9 months old during this unsettled period around the family's move toward Burr Oak. The family later moved out of the hotel and into a room above a grocery store. By the late summer or early fall of 1877, they had left Burr Oak and returned to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, back to the same town they had left a year before, back to another start from zero. For Laura, Burr Oak became a missing chapter. For Carrie, it was not missing. She lived it. Carrie was 7 years old. She had already lived in Kansas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Minnesota again. 5 locations before her 8th birthday. None of them permanent. None of them are safe in the way that permanence makes things safe. What does that kind of movement do to a child? The record does not give us Carrie's interior reaction. It gives us the pattern, and the pattern is its own kind of answer. Repeated displacement in early childhood means constantly rebuilding the basic scaffolding of daily life. New routines, new weather, new sounds at night, new faces, new ground under your feet that you have not yet learned to read. For any child, that is a significant ask. For a child whose body was already operating with less physical reserve, it was a compounding cost on top of every other cost, a thin child inside a thin margin. The second Walnut Grove period lasted until 1879. By then, Charles Ingalls had accepted a job as a timekeeper for a railroad construction crew pushing west into Dakota Territory, and the family followed. They arrived in what would become Smet, South Dakota, then still Dakota Territory, in the spring of 1879. Carrie was 8 years old. This was not the end of every move, but it was the first place that finally held. Smet is where the Ingalls family stayed. It is where Laura grew up, taught school, and met Wilder. It is where Mary went to the Iowa College for the Blind, funded by community collection and state support. It is where the family built the small life that Laura would eventually turn into American legend. But before Smet became home, it was just another place where the wagon stopped. Now, while all of this was happening, while the Ingalls family was packing and unpacking, losing crops and changing states, living in dugouts and hotel rooms and borrowed spaces, something was happening 800 miles to the northeast that the Little House books would eventually weave into the same pioneer myth, as though both families shared the same starting line. The Wilder family in Burke and Malone in northern New York was farming, not moving, farming. James Wilder, Almanzo's father, had established his farm on good northern New York land and was working it in the deliberate, rooted way that only comes from staying in one place long enough to understand what the ground can do. The barn on the Wilder farm was large. The granary held grain through the winter. There were horses, multiple teams. There was a family embedded in a community where they had been neighbours for years, where credit was available because their credit was good, where a bad harvest meant hardship but not displacement. One family kept packing trunks, the other kept filling barns. Both families will eventually be gathered under the same pioneer myth, brave settlers who built lives with their own hands, and both did work hard. That is not the question. The question is what risk means when one family has a full barn behind them and the other is selling land at a loss after 3 days to afford the next wagon west. We will come back to that barn. The closer we get to the long winter, the more that barn is going to matter. But we are not at the long winter yet. We are still in the wagon. And there is one more thing about the cost of all this movement that the chronology alone does not capture. It has to do with what Carrie was building, or rather what she could not build, during these years of constant relocation. Childhood development in the 19th century did not use the language of modern psychology, but the frontier community understood something about children in practical terms. A child who was frequently sick needed stability. A child who needed to conserve physical energy needed consistent food, consistent warmth, consistent routine. A child who could not always keep up physically with her siblings needed an environment that did not constantly demand she start over. Carrie needed what any delicate child needed in that era: food, warmth, routine, and fewer shocks to the body. Her family could rarely guarantee all four at once. This is not Pa's fault. This is not Ma's fault. The economic forces pressing on the Ingalls family, locust plagues, failed crops, debt, a land system that gave poor families an entry point but almost no margin for error, were structural. Caroline Fraser's Pulitzer, prize-winning biography, Prairie Fires, documents in detail how many frontier families operated in the same brutal cycle: arrive with hope, absorb disaster, sell at a loss, move again. The Ingalls family was not uniquely unlucky. They were representatives, but Carrie's particular experience of that representative unluckiness was shaped by her particular body. Every move was another disruption to whatever fragile routine Ma had managed to build around her younger daughter's limitations. Every cold new house was another respiratory challenge. Every stretch of thin winter provisions was another season her small body had to manage on less than it needed. The frontier did not ask whether a child was strong enough. It asked the same thing of everyone. By the time the family reached Smet in 1879, the place that would finally become their centre, Carrie had spent her entire conscious life learning one thing above all others. Nothing stayed long, and every new beginning had a price. She was 8 years old. The long winter was 1 year away. And the most physically punishing experience of her childhood had not yet arrived. But the education that would make her capable of surviving it had already begun. Watching her family lose things and start again, learning that hardship was not an interruption, but a condition, and discovering that the wagon did not wait for the child who needed more time. Frailty was the fact. Survival was the answer she had not yet finished giving. The winter did not care which child was strongest. That is the thing about winter that keeps coming back for 7 months. It does not make exceptions. It does not negotiate with a family's courage, or reward their faith, or respect the fact that one of their children already had less margin to give than the others. The hard winter of 1880 to 1881 came down on Smet, Dakota territory, the way weather comes when it has nothing to prove, total, indifferent, and patient. The blizzards began cutting De Smet off in October 1880. Not for a week, not for a difficult stretch that passed. The tracks drifted under so fast and so completely that regular supply became unreliable, then impossible. The last supply train reached De Smet sometime in early November, and then the town, a raw, barely standing collection of wooden storefronts and thin-walled houses on the open Dakota plain, was on its own until May 1881. 7 months. Think about what that meant in physical, practical terms for a family without a deep cellar, without a root storage that could see them through. The Ingalls family that winter was living in town, in their store building on 2nd Street, not in a farmhouse with any kind of established provisions. Charles Ingalls had been in Dakota Territory only since 1879. He had not had time to build the kind of stored-up supply that a family with years on established land could lean on. Whatever was in that building at the start of winter was what they had. The record for that winter, verified across historical accounts of De Smet and documented in Caroline Fraser's Prairie fires, shows temperatures dropping to 40 below zero, with winds that made outdoor movement actively dangerous for days at a time. Fuel ran critically short across the town. Families burned twisted hay because they had no wood. Food stores depleted faster than anyone had planned for because no one had planned for 7 months. For Carrie, this was not a story about weather yet. It was the sound of grown-ups counting food. It was the smell of hay twisted for fuel. It was the knowledge that warmth had become work, and that even staying inside no longer meant being safe. This is where the ledger stops being a metaphor. In a family with 5 people sharing whatever warmth and food a single building could hold through a winter that cold, the body with the smallest reserves burns through those reserves first. Carrie was 10 years old in the fall of 1880. She had already spent her entire childhood in a body biographers describe as chronically slight, small in ways that frontier life could not quite explain away as simply young. Mary had gone blind the previous year. Laura was 13, and described by family accounts as strong, physically robust in the way Carrie was not. Grace was 4, small enough to be carried. But Carrie occupied that particular in-between position, old enough to feel the full weight of what was happening, young enough that her body was still building, and not constitutionally equipped to take what that winter asked of it without cost. We do not know exactly what the long winter did to Carrie's body. The record does not give us a physician's note or a direct account of her specific suffering. What the record gives us is the documented severity of the winter itself, and the physical profile of the child who lived inside it. That is enough to understand the question. When historians ask why Carrie Ingalls spent portions of her adult life seeking warmer, drier climates, when the record shows her travelling to Boulder, Colorado in 1905, and at other points to Wyoming, seeking relief from respiratory illness, the long winter is not the only answer, but it sits in that ledger as one possible entry. A body under that kind of sustained cold, that kind of nutritional stress, in a building heated by twisted hay during a Dakota winter. A body like Carrie's body does not emerge from 7 months of that unchanged. Survival is not always loud. Sometimes survival is a child sitting still because moving wastes heat. Here is something Laura's books do not linger on, but the historical record confirms. Ingalls and Wilder and his friend Cap Garland made a supply run during that winter, crossing open, unmapped, blizzard-threatened prairie to find a settler named Anderson who had a cache of wheat and hauling it back to De Smet so the town could eat. The story appears in the long winter as one of the book's genuinely gripping chapters. It is also historically documented, verified across multiple sources including Wilder's own later accounts. That wheat helped keep the town eating. Now hold that detail up next to the Ingalls cellar, next to whatever thin stock of provisions Charles Ingalls had managed to accumulate in a store building in a town he had barely arrived in, and ask yourself a quiet question. Ingalls and Wilder was 23 years old that winter. He had come to De Smet from a family in northern New York that had been farming established land for decades. His father's farm in the Malone area was documented in census and land records as a prosperous capital-holding operation, the kind of farm that could send a young man out to Dakota Territory with enough of a grubstake to file a homestead claim, build a house, and still have a loaded grain barn behind him. The wheat he and Garland found and hauled back, it fed families who had arrived in De Smet the same way the Ingalls family had arrived. Recent, thin-margined, not yet rooted. The boy from the full barn helped the families from the bare cellars survive the winter. That is not a villain's story. Almanzo did not think of it that way, and there is no evidence he should have. He took genuine risks on that supply run. The weather on that prairie was not a metaphor. It was 40 below and actively capable of killing a man who made a wrong turn. But the capacity to take that particular risk, to have a horse, a sled, the physical reserves, and the psychological stability to volunteer for it, that capacity did not come from nowhere. It came from a starting position the Ingalls family simply did not share. Both men believed in risk. Only one had a cushion when risk went wrong. The town survived the winter. That is the sentence that gets written, and it is true. Carrie survived the winter. That is also true. But there is a version of surviving that the books tend to skip over, the version where the body remembers what the story moves past. By spring 1881, when the supply trains began running again, and the biographies generally describe a kind of collective exhale across to Smet, Carrie Ingalls was 10 years old and had just come through 7 months of sustained cold, reduced food, and the particular terror of watching a family manage crisis in a building not designed for it. She had done that after years of moving, after grasshoppers, after Plum Creek, after Bur Oak, after whatever her small body had already quietly absorbed before she was old enough to name it. The record does not call this damage. History tends not to reach for that word about children who continued functioning. But a body can continue functioning and still be carrying something forward. There is one more thing the long winter introduced to the Ingalls world that the books treat as primarily Mary's story, and Laura's story, and Pa's story. Something that happened in the household structure, in the way the family organised itself around who needed what, that would shape Carrie's position for the next several years in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Mary Ingalls had lost her sight by 1879. In Laura's books, the cause is remembered as scarlet fever, but historians and medical researchers have questioned whether that explanation was a simplification of a more complicated illness. What is not disputed is the outcome. Mary was blind by the time the family's de Smet years began, and she was blind through the hard winter and the years that followed. After the long winter, the family's attention, its emotional gravity, its daily labour, its planning, had to arrange itself around two facts simultaneously. One was survival, the other was Mary. And when a household has to organise itself around two things that large, there's often a third person who gets organised around instead, who becomes useful precisely because they are not the crisis, not the narrator, not the named tragedy. Carrie. When Mary's world went dark, the whole house had to rearrange itself. Where Carrie stood in that rearrangement, what it cost her, what it quietly built in her, and what it prepared her for, that is where this story goes next. When Mary's world went dark, the house did not go quiet. It went carefully. Every surface stayed where it was placed. The chair stayed against the same wall. The table did not shift. The door to the outside opened in the same direction it always had. None of this was coincidence. It was management. The slow, deliberate work of a family that had lost one member's sight and now had to compensate for that loss with the bodies and attention of everyone else who still had theirs. Carrie was around 9 or 10 when this rearrangement began. Not the oldest. Not the one who had lost something. Not the baby. Not the one who would write it all down later. She was the one in the middle of it. Old enough to understand what had changed, young enough that nobody sat her down to explain what it would cost. The historical record does not give us the exact moment Mary's sight went. It came in stages, scholars now believe, though Laura's book shaped the popular memory of it as a single, devastating blow after scarlet fever. Medical historians and researchers who have examined the question, including those who contributed analysis cited by Caroline Fraser in Prairie Fires, have raised serious doubts about that simple explanation. The illness or combination of illnesses that led to Mary's blindness may have been more medically complicated than a single childhood fever. The timeline in the books is a memoir timeline, compressed and smoothed, the way memory smooths things that happen slowly and terribly over time. What the record does confirm, by about 14, Mary Ingalls had lost her functional sight. The family that had survived grasshopper years and blizzard winters and the near collapse of every plan Pa had ever made, that family now had a blind member at the centre of it. And a blind member does not simply add one more hardship to a list. a blind member restructures the architecture of a household. Think about what a household actually is. Not the building. The building was thin walls and limited space. The household is the pattern of bodies inside the building. Who moves, who stays, who goes first through a doorway, who wakes earliest, who keeps track of where things were left and whether they were put back. A household is a kind of choreography that most people never notice because they learned it before they could name it. When Mary lost her sight, that choreography had to be relearned. The chair mattered, where it sat, which way it faced, whether it was a reliable marker in the room, a thing Mary could find with her hand and trust to be there. This was not decoration. This was navigation. In a small house on the Dakota Prairie, where the family had less square footage than some people's porches, the placement of a chair was a kind of communication, a quiet statement that the room would hold still for the person who could no longer see it moving. Plant that image. We'll come back to it. Mary's blindness, when understood as a household event rather than a personal tragedy, becomes something different from what the books described. The books, Laura's books, approached it as Mary's story. A brave girl going blind, the loss, the adjustment, the schooling that would come later, the Iowa College for the Blind at Vinton, where Mary would go beginning in 1881, and where she would spend years learning to read by touch and to live with precision and intelligence inside a world that had gone visually dark. That story is real, and it is worth honouring. But there was a second story happening inside the same house, and it involved every person who was not Mary. Caroline Ingalls, Maya, reorganised herself around her oldest daughter's new needs. Charles Ingalls, Pa, began saving toward the cost of Vinton, because Mary's education would not be free, and a blind daughter could not be left without skills for the rest of her life. Laura, who had already become the family's observer, took on a new and specific role. She became Mary's eyes in language. She described things. She narrated what she saw so that Mary could hold a picture of it. This is documented in multiple accounts, and would later become one of the defining emotional threads of Laura's own books, the way she learned to translate the visible world into words for her sister. It also became, Laura would later suggest, part of how she learned to write. The blindness that named Mary also, in a traceable way, helped shape Laura into the author she eventually became. Where was Carrie in this? She was right there. She was always right there. But right there is not the same as named. And this is the thing the household record reveals if you look at it long enough. The people who provide essential daily labour inside a family are often the people whose contribution goes least narrated. Mary needed attention, patience, and specific human accommodation. Laura provided the gift of description. Vivid, skilled, literary in its early form even before Laura knew she was practicing anything. Ma and Pa provided the anchor of parental structure, the planning, the grief management, the financial calculation. Carrie provided the daily texture of living beside a blind sister without making it into anything. That is a specific skill. It is not a small one, and it is one that children in her position almost never receive credit for, because the skill is invisible. It looks like nothing because it has been successfully completed. Here is what that daily texture involved, put plainly. A sighted sibling living with a blind family member learns, fairly quickly, not to leave things where they do not belong, not to rearrange furniture without warning, not to walk fast through a doorway without a sound, not to assume that what is visible to you has been communicated to the person beside you who cannot see it. These are not grand acts of sacrifice. They are tiny recalibrations of behaviour, repeated every single day, that cost almost nothing individually and cost a great deal cumulatively. A 10-year-old, then 11, 12, 13, absorbs those adjustments into her body. She learns the room. She learns to be loud enough to be located and quiet enough not to startle. She learns to hand things correctly, not in the general direction of a person's face, but to the hand placed there, waiting. Plant that image too, the hand. The deliberate, careful placement of something in someone else's hand. Not thrown, not set down nearby, but placed. Because placed means received. And a blind person's world runs, partly, on the reliability of placement. Carrie's hands were in this daily machinery. The record does not itemize what she carried, fetched, adjusted, or delivered. Records like that do not exist for frontier children in the 1880s, especially not for girls, especially not for girls who are not the subject of a famous book series. But the structure around her tells us something, because structure is what survives when personal testimony does not. Now, she was the second youngest in the family at this point. Grace, the youngest, was still small enough to need tending herself. That means the labour that required capability, the careful, watching, competent, alert kind of labour, fell along a very short list of names. Pa was working, Ma was managing a household and a blind teenager, and everything else a frontier domestic life demanded. Laura, 2 years older than Carrie, had her own weight to carry. She was already working toward contributing to the family's income, taking on teaching positions as a teenager, famously beginning to teach school at 15 to help fund Mary's education at Vinton. Carrie did not become a teacher at 15. She did not have the credential or the health or perhaps the specific ability Laura had. But she was still in the household. She was still part of its daily mechanics. And the household's daily mechanics were, in this period, organised significantly around Mary's needs and the collective Ingalls' ambition to get Mary to Vinton. This is what it means to say that love creates labour. The Ingalls family loved Mary. Deeply, clearly, without apparent resentment. The record does not suggest bitterness in any surviving account. But love is not a separate category from work. Love in a 19th century frontier household is often indistinguishable from what you do all day to keep the people you love alive and functional. The love and the labour are the same event, recorded differently depending on who does the writing. Mary did eventually get to Vinton. She enrolled at the Iowa College for the Blind in 1881 and remained connected to the school for years, completing her course in 1889. The exact financial burden should be handled carefully. The published Little House version emphasises Laura's work helping the family manage Mary's schooling, while historical summaries note that Dakota Territory support also mattered. What is safe to say is this: Mary's future became a family project. She learned to read by touch, to sew, and to live with the precision the school demanded. This was genuinely remarkable. The decision to send Mary there, the financial sacrifice it required, the commitment it represented, reflects a family that refused to abandon the idea that Mary's life could be full. That is not a small thing. It deserves acknowledgement. But it is also worth sitting with what the decision required from everyone else. The money going toward Vinton was money with a shape, a weight, a consequence for every other Ingalls' needs. In a household running on a grain farmer's income on the Dakota Plains in the early 1880s, surplus did not accumulate easily. Every dollar saved for Mary's tuition was a dollar that had to be earned and held somewhere that it could not be spent on something else. That discipline, across months and years, pressed down on the whole household, not as resentment, but as shared sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice that takes such a constant, ordinary form that it stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like just the way life is. The way life is for Carrie was Mary's chair in the corner, the careful room, the careful hands, and the family treasury organised around a future that had Mary at its centre. And here is the turn that Chapter 4 is really built around, the one worth sitting with slowly. Carrie was not the tragedy. She was not the crisis. And in a family where the crisis had a name and a chair and a ledger line dedicated to its resolution, being the non-crisis was its own specific condition. A crisis gets witnesses. A crisis gets planning. A crisis gets named, gets discussed, gets organised around. The non-crisis is simply expected to function. There is a category of child in family systems. Historians of childhood and family sociologists have written about this, though rarely with frontier families specifically, who becomes what you might call the competent background person. Not neglected in any dramatic sense, not abused, not unloved, but operating in a household where the primary attention is organised around someone else, and therefore learning to be useful without requiring management, helpful without requiring acknowledgement, present without requiring notice. We cannot prove Carrie paid for this with private resentment or hidden bitterness. We should not invent that. But the pattern around her suggests that her position in the post-blindness Ingalls household had this shape. She was available. She was capable enough. She was not the crisis. These three facts together describe a child who could be relied upon, which is not nothing, but which is also not the same as being seen. There are tasks every caregiving home creates that nobody writes in the account book. Not the dramatic tasks, not the going to Vinton kind of decision. The other kind, the 100 times a day kind, the picking something up before it becomes a problem kind. The quiet alertness of a person who has learned to track two realities at once, their own movement through the world and the accommodation that the person beside them requires. These tasks do not record themselves. There is no column in a farm ledger for hours spent navigating around a blind sister's needs. There is no category in a census for family members who absorb the daily ambient cost of disability. There is no 19th century accounting system that captures what it costs a child's body and attention to be continuously reliable in this way. This is not a complaint about the Ingalls family. It is a complaint about the record, and about what the record chooses to measure. History remembers Mary's blindness. It remembers the decision to send her to Vinton. It remembers Laura's gift of description. It barely remembers the sister who learned the room so that the room could keep working. Laura watched. That is not an accusation. It is a structural fact with consequences. Laura's particular genius, and it was genius whatever else you want to say about the books and their adjustments and omissions, was the genius of observation. She watched her family. She held them in language. She turned what she saw into a record of pioneer life that outlasted everyone in it. But a narrator is, by definition, slightly outside the frame of what she's watching. Laura was not exempt from the household's daily demands. She was contributing financially, teaching, and working, but her relationship to her family was increasingly that of a witness, someone who translated experience into meaning, who stood at a particular angle to the events and gave them form. Carrie did not have a narrator's angle. She had a participant's angle. She was inside the machinery, not watching it. And the machinery she was inside was a household organised around a blind sister's needs and a family's financial sacrifice, and a set of daily adjustments that had no author to record them as anything other than just the way life was. The gap between the narrator's position and the participant's position is not a moral failing. Laura did not choose to be the observer instead of choosing Carrie. These are structural roles, partly chosen and partly assigned, that emerge from temperament and circumstance and birth order and specific ability. But the gap has consequences. The narrator's life gets narrated. The participant's life gets absorbed into the background of the narrator's story. Carrie lived in that background, not because she was less, because the story had already been claimed. What does it do to a child to become useful before she becomes visible? Not useful in the abstract celebrated way. The heroic pioneer child does her part way. Useful in the specific, daily, unremarkable way. The way that means your function is noted only when it fails to happen. We cannot know what Carrie experienced internally. The record does not give us her voice in this period. No diary, no memoir, no letters from this part of her childhood survive in accessible public archives. We are working from structure, from documented family context, from the historical logic of her position, but we can ask what the structure suggests. A physically slight child, already described as less robust than her siblings, taking up a position of quiet daily competence inside a household, organised around someone else's named difficulty. That is a specific kind of pressure. It is not the dramatic pressure of starvation or frostbite. It is the sustained, low-frequency pressure of being needed without being the one the family worry lands on. It builds differently than acute crisis. It settles into the body differently. And a body already described as having less margin than the people around it absorbs that pressure differently than a robust body would. This is not invented by suffering. This is the logic of what the structure required. The record suggests she bore it. It does not tell us what that cost. By the time Carrie was moving through her mid-teens, the household had been reorganised around Mary's absence as much as it had been reorganised around her blindness. Mary was at Vinton for significant stretches of time. The daily accommodation of her needs was replaced by the daily fact of her absence, and the family's orientation toward her eventual return, her education, her future. And still the house required its choreography. The Ingalls family was not a household in which the departure of one member meant less work for the others. It meant different work. It meant the labour redistributed, found new shapes, settled into new people. Carrie was still there, still available, still not the narrator, still not the crisis, still not the youngest. Grace had that role. Still not Pa's musical companion or Ma's named confidant in the written record. She was the competent middle, the one the household could rely on precisely because she did not present an additional problem. In a family with as many pressing needs as the Ingalls family carried, being reliably non-problematic was not a small contribution, but it was also the kind of contribution that disappears, that becomes invisible not because it was not real, but because it was perfectly successful. The thing that works smoothly is the thing nobody thinks to describe. Here is the image this chapter wants to leave you with. Mary's chair against the wall, a fixed point in a small room, placed there deliberately, reliably, so that a person who could no longer see the room could still trust one part of it. A navigational promise. Around that fixed point Carrie moved. Not centre frame, not the named subject, not the one the chair was placed for, but moving, adjusting, carrying what needed carrying, placing what needed placing, keeping the room in the shape the room needed to be. She was in her mid-teens. She had survived things that would have ended many children's lives. She had survived them in a body that biographers consistently describe as slight, as less physically cushioned than her siblings. And she had survived them in a family where survival itself was not the end of the story. It was just the prerequisite for the next set of demands. The crisis had a name. The crisis had a chair. The crisis had a plan. A school in Iowa. A community fundraising effort. A line in Laura's eventual books where it would be remembered by millions of readers. Carrie had the room around the chair. And the room around the chair required its own kind of attention, its own kind of labour, its own kind of learning. History remembers the blindness. It rarely remembers the sister who learned the room around it. Mary would come home from Vinton in the summers. She would bring back skills, needlework, reading by touch, the measured discipline of a young woman who had been trained to be precise. She would bring back a version of herself that had been shaped by something outside the Ingalls household, something with its own structure and language and expectation. And Carrie would be there, in the same small house, with the same chair in the same corner, growing older now in a way the chapters ahead will follow. Because the next question is not what Carrie did inside the household that organised itself around Mary's blindness. The next question is what Carrie became when she finally stepped outside it. She was past the middle of her teens now. The prairie around Smet was not getting easier. The family had survived weather, blindness, debt and hunger. But surviving is not the same as arriving. Carrie had been useful, present, reliable. She had learned the room. Now the room was going to change again. Not because of blindness, not because of weather, but because Carrie was growing into a world that would require her to become something more than the background person the household had learned to depend on. What she did with that, what she built, what she found, what she chose, is where this story goes next. The first time Carrie stepped beyond the family story, history still almost missed her. Not because she disappeared, not because she failed, but because the world that documented pioneer life was far more interested in beginnings, homesteads claimed, storms survived, crops planted, than in the slow, ordinary, dignified process of a young woman building a working life in a small Dakota town. Carrie Ingalls did not vanish after the childhood books ended. She kept going. She just kept going quietly, and quiet women are the ones history has to be reminded to look for. Smet, South Dakota, in the early 1880s was not a sentimental place. It was a working town, a raw grid of wooden storefronts, a depot, a newspaper office, a hardware operation, dry goods, a post office that doubled as a rumour exchange. The people who lived there were not characters in a children's book. They were settlers trying to make an economy out of grassland and willpower. Commerce moved through that town every day, notices posted, land records filed, crops priced and repriced, and the local paper, the Smet News, and later other small-town newspapers connected to Carrie's working life, keeping the machinery of public information turning over, week by week. This is the town Carrie was growing up inside of, not the soft-lit, fire-lit interior of a Little House chapter. The actual town, with its mud and its Monday morning business, and its need for people who could do skilled, careful, repetitive work without complaint. There is a kind of labour that does not look romantic but demands everything from the person doing it. Typesetting is one of those kinds of labour. Compositing type by hand, pulling individual letters from a type case, placing them in a composing stick, building lines of text backward and in mirror image so they print forward, is meticulous, exacting, and physically demanding on the hands. It is also a trade that required genuine literacy. You could not set type accurately if you could not read. You could not read proof effectively if you could not spell, pass a sentence, catch an error the editor had missed. It was quiet work, but it was not mindless work, and biographical summaries of Carrie Ingalls' adult life indicate that she worked in newspaper offices, doing typesetting or related press work, during her time in Smet. Pause on that for a moment, because it matters more than it sounds. The type case held an entire alphabet in small sorted wooden compartments. Capital letters in the upper case, lowercase in the lower. A compositor reached into that case dozens, hundreds of times per day, finding the right letter, placing it, moving on, finding the next. The hands learned the layout. The mind tracked the sentence. The eyes moved between the manuscript and the composing stick, constantly checking. It was precision work, and it was Carrie's work. Think about what Carrie's hands already knew before she walked into a newspaper office. They knew how to move around a room another person could not see. They knew how to pass, pour, fold, steady. They had been trained for years in careful attention to placement and sequence. A type case is not so different in the end from a kitchen she navigated for someone else, except the type case had a different payoff, something the whole town would read. The Smet News was founded in 1880. The Ingalls family knew its founders and its orbit. Pa had dealings with the local press, notices, advertisements, and civic information. Smet's newspapers were not big city operations. They were small shop papers, dependent on hand labour, tight deadlines, and whatever trained staff were available. That staff often included young women. In small Dakota towns, women did work in newspaper offices, setting type, pulling proofs, managing subscription lists, because the labour pool was thin and the need was constant. This was not exceptional for Carrie, this was practical. But practical in Carrie's case is never a small word. Practical means she showed up. Practical means she learned. Practical means she produced something the town could hold in its hands on a Friday morning without knowing who had set the type. A newspaper office does not care who the heroine is. It cares whether the E-box is full and the column inches are right and the paper runs on time. Carrie met that standard. The record suggests she did. Work is one way a quiet person becomes real. Not famous, not celebrated, but real. In the sense that her contribution left a trace beyond the household. Inside the Ingalls home, her labour was absorbed by the family, invisible to anyone who didn't live under that roof. Outside, in the newspaper office, her labour was absorbed into public record. Every notice printed, every column of type cleanly composed, every edition that reached a subscriber's door. Those were products that carried silently the competence of everyone who had worked on them. Carrie's name did not appear in the paper as its author, but her hands helped make the paper that carried other people's names. That irony is worth sitting with. She helped produce public words while her own life remained barely written. The woman setting type for the town's announcements, legal notices and community news was the same woman who would later be described in almost every historical account, primarily as Laura Ingalls Wilder's younger sister. The newspaper office would not have called her that. In the newspaper office, she was a compositor. She was a worker. She was the person who showed up. Smet was also a social world, and Carrie moved through it. She was not confined to the office or the homestead. She attended church, participated in town life, was part of the social fabric of a small community that knew everyone's business and measured everyone quietly. In a town that size, a young woman who worked, who had a skill, who earned, occupied a specific kind of social position. Not elevated exactly, but self-sufficient in a way that mattered in communities where self-sufficiency was the central moral value. The street mattered. The walk from the Ingalls house to the newspaper office, past the dry goods, past the depot, past the post office. That walk was a threshold Carrie crossed regularly. Every time she crossed it, she was doing something that the Little House books never quite captured. She was choosing a public role in a working world, not just a private role in a family story. The household had taught her to be useful. The street required her to be competent. Those are not the same thing. Yet a paycheck is not romance. Sometimes it is dignity. Carrie's wages, whatever they amounted to, and the surviving record does not preserve exact figures, were not going to make her wealthy. Newspaper compositing in a small Dakota town was modest work, modestly compensated, but money earned by your own hands in your own right is a different category of thing than money managed by a father or allocated by a household budget. It belongs to the person who earned it. It is evidence that she was hired, that someone assessed her capability and said yes, that she could perform a skilled task consistently enough to be kept on, that her contribution had a value the world would assign a number to. The Ingalls family had lived for years inside the arithmetic of thin margins, crops that might cover the mortgage, winters that might not break before the food ran out. Carrie had grown up understanding at a cellular level what it meant to count carefully. What her wages gave her was something different, a number that came from competence, not from weather, a number that did not depend on whether the grasshoppers arrived or the hail missed the fields. She earned it. The weather had no vote. What the biographical record captures of Carrie's adult life in Smet is partial but suggestive. She worked. She remained in Smet into adulthood. She was a presence in the community. She would eventually leave Dakota for the Black Hills, the town of Keystone, South Dakota, where she would marry David N. Swansea in 1912, a widower with children. But that is Chapter 6's story. What belongs to Chapter 5 is the space between childhood and that departure. The years when Carrie was neither the child in the books nor the older married woman she would become, but the adult in formation working in a small prairie town and building a life from the inside out. That in-between space is exactly the space that gets erased. It gets erased because Laura's books end before it becomes visible. The Little House series traces the Ingalls family through childhood and courtship and early marriage, through Laura's eyes, toward Laura's life. Carrie exists in those pages as a child. She is 9 in By the Shores of Silver Lake. She's a teenager in these happy golden years. But by the time those books were written, Laura composing from memory in the 1930s and 1940s, Carrie's adult life had already happened, already been lived in full, and was simply outside the frame Laura was building. The frame was not malicious. It was a frame. Every frame leaves something out. What it left out was adult Carrie, working, earning, moving, choosing. There is a specific kind of reader grief that comes from loving the Little House books. You read them as a child and you fall in love with a world, the firelight, the fiddle, the voices, the stubborn warmth of that family inside every winter they survived. And Carrie is there. She is always there, a small presence in the corner of the room, contributing her quiet part to the household story. You accept her at the size the books give her. Then you grow up and you start asking, but what did she become? And the books do not answer, because the books end. And most readers never go looking for the answer beyond the page. But she became something. She became someone who went to work in a newspaper office in a pioneer town, who set type by hand, who walked the main street of Smet as a working adult, who built enough of herself to eventually leave for the Black Hills and make an entirely different life. She did not become the story, but she began touching the machinery that made stories public, and she did it without anyone writing it down for her. That is not a footnote. That is a life. And here is the thing about Carrie's adult work that the type of case makes clear. Every letter in that case was individual. Every A and every H and every lowercase sat in its own compartment, waiting to be picked up and placed in the right order. The compositor's job was to take all those individual pieces and arrange them into something a reader could follow. You could not rush it. You could not approximate. Either the type was set correctly or it wasn't. Either the column justified properly or it didn't. Either the proof came back clean, or the compositor went back and found the error. Carrie had been living by that standard her whole life, the standard of getting it right, or someone suffers, the standard of precision before comfort, the standard of doing careful things without applause. She just moved that standard from one room to another. The town did not celebrate her for it. Towns rarely celebrate people for doing their work well and without drama. The local paper ran its editions. The subscribers read their copies. The type was distributed back into the case, and the whole process began again the following week. Carrie's competence was built into the rhythm of a town that was itself being built. But rhythm is not nothing. Routine, competence, contribution, repetition. These are the materials an adult life is made of, and they are not lesser materials for being ordinary. The newspaper office demanded them. Carrie supplied them. And in doing so, she crossed from the world of family usefulness into the world of civic usefulness, a distinction that seems small until you realize it is the difference between being needed and being capable. Her family needed her because she was theirs. The newspaper office needed her because she was good. The books left Carrie small because childhood ended before her real adult shape appeared. But in the newspaper office, in the town, in the work no child could do for her, Carrie Ingalls began becoming someone the books had never had room to show. She was not waiting for a larger story to include her. She was building one. One letter at a time, one edition at a time, in a Dakota town that was already moving on before anyone thought to write her down. In Chapter 6, we follow her as she moves, out of Smet, into the Black Hills, into the life she chose rather than the life she was born into. Because Carrie's story does not end in the type room either. It keeps moving, and the further it moves from the little house frame, the more it becomes entirely, undeniably, her own. Keystone was not a Little House chapter. That is exactly why it matters. By the time Carrie Ingalls arrived in the Black Hills, the story most people knew about her had already ended, sealed inside a childhood that belonged more to Laura's memory than to Carrie's adult life. But Carrie was still alive, still moving, and still becoming someone the books had no room to show. This chapter is not about where she came from. You already know where she came from. This chapter is about where she went, and who she was when she got there. There is something almost deliberate about a woman who spent her childhood on open prairie, eventually settling inside a landscape of ridges, granite walls, and pine-covered slopes. The Black Hills of South Dakota rise out of the flatlands the way an argument interrupts a long silence, sudden, steep, and impossible to ignore. Keystone sat tucked inside those hills, a working town shaped not by wheat and weather the way Smet had been, but by awe and extraction, by men who came looking for what the ground was hiding. Carrie arrived in a landscape built on digging things up. The Black Hills gold rush era had peaked before she arrived, but the infrastructure it left behind, the towns, the roads cut into hillsides, the commerce organized around mining operations, the Mount Rushmore area that would later draw national attention, all of that formed the adult world Carrie chose to enter. Keystone in the early 20th century was not a ghost town, not a ruin, and not a frontier dream evaporating into dust. It was a functioning community with real economy, real social structure, and real demands on the people who lived there. It was, in other words, the kind of place where a woman could be someone other than a character in someone else's story. The record does not give us a precise account of every reason Carrie moved toward the Black Hills when she did. Biographical summaries note that health considerations shaped her adult geography. The altitude, the drier air, the climate distinct from the flat Dakota prairie she had grown up on. For a woman whose respiratory system had negotiated hard terms her entire life, geography was never just scenery. It was medicine. It was a practical calculation made by a body that had learned over decades exactly how much it could and could not tolerate. This was not weakness driving her west into the hills. This was management. Think about what movement meant to Carrie at different points in her life. As a child, movement meant the wagon loaded and the house behind her gone. Movement meant Pa had made a decision, and the family had followed. Movement meant new towns, new schools, new winters, and another set of neighbours who would have to be learned from scratch. Movement was something done to the Ingalls children, not by them. By the time Carrie Ingalls packed a trunk and moved toward the Black Hills as an adult woman, the verb had changed completely. She was not being relocated. She was relocating. That distinction sounds small until you hold both images side by side. The child in the wagon seat, watching the last known place disappear behind her, and the adult woman with a travel bag making a decision about her own life that no one else had made for her. The geography of Carrie's adult years was not forced on her the way frontier childhood had been. The record suggests she moved toward Keystone with intention, drawn there by work, by community, by climate, and eventually by the man she would marry. A suitcase and a wagon carry the same amount of distance, but they carry it differently. One belongs to the child who goes where she's taken. The other belongs to the woman who decides where she's going. Carrie was no longer the child. She had not been the child for a long time. Here is what the historical record makes clear about Carrie's adult health. It was a continuing negotiation, not a terminal condition, and not a story she let define her identity the way others might have. She had sought climate relief as early as 1905, travelling to Boulder, Colorado, a detail already noted in this documentary. But what the broader biographical record shows is that Carrie did not simply retreat from life because her body set limits. She adapted her life around those limits without making the limits the centre of the story. She worked. She moved when moving helped. She stayed when staying was practical. She married at 42, which speaks plainly to a woman who had not spent her adult decades collapsing. 42 years old in 1912, making a legal commitment to another person, agreeing to take on a household, a man's children, and the responsibilities of a life built for two people and more. That is not the biography of a woman defeated by her own body. The Black Hills altitude likely suited her better than de Smet's flat, wind-hammered prairie. The drier air of the higher terrain was, in the early 20th century, a recognised factor in respiratory health. One reason sanatoriums and health seekers frequently move toward elevated western landscapes. Whether Carrie moved to Keystone purely for health reasons, or whether health was one consideration among several, the record does not say with certainty. What it does say is that she made the Black Hills her home and that she stayed. She stayed for decades. That is its own kind of answer. You cannot understand Carrie's adult life without understanding Keystone as a physical and social reality, not just a name on a map. Keystone, South Dakota, sits in Pennington County, nestled in the southern Black Hills roughly 6 miles from what would become the Mount Rushmore National Memorial, though the carving of those presidential faces did not begin until 1927, well after Carrie had already settled in the region. The town itself had been founded in the 1880s during the Black Hills mining activity, and its economy moved through multiple phases over the decades: gold and silver mining, mica mining, feldspar extraction, and eventually the tourism economy that the Mount Rushmore project would bring. Keystone was not one industry frozen in amber. It was a working community that adapted. The social structure of a mining-adjacent Black Hills town was different from the social structure of a Dakota prairie town like de Smet. De Smet had been organised around homestead agriculture, around the rhythms of planting and harvest, around neighbours who were, like the Ingalls, trying to hold claims against weather and debt. Keystone was organised around extraction and commerce, around a different set of risks and a different kind of community identity. The people who built lives there were not waiting for a wheat harvest to tell them whether the year had been good. They were part of an economy that moved differently, spent differently, and failed differently. For Carrie, who had spent her working years in de Smet producing a newspaper for a farming community, this shift represented a genuine change in the texture of daily life. She was not simply moving 40 miles down the road. She was entering a different social and economic world, one where the Black Hills themselves, the physical geography, the pine slopes and the granite formations and the cold, clean air formed the backdrop of ordinary days. Biographical summaries describe Carrie as having been active in the Keystone community. The record does not paint her as a recluse retreating from the world because her health demanded quiet. She was present. She was part of where she lived. Keystone knew who she was, not as a famous sister, not as a Little House character, but as a neighbour. In 1912, Caroline Celestia Ingalls married David N. Swansea. She was 42 years old. He was a widower. Those 3 facts, stated plainly in sequence, already say something worth pausing on. Carrie Ingalls waited, if waited is even the right word, until her 40s to marry. She had spent her 20s and 30s as a working woman, employed, self-sufficient, geographically mobile, building a life through competence rather than through domestic arrangement. When she married David Swansea, she was not a young woman stepping into adulthood through marriage, the way the social conventions of her era often prescribed. She was a middle-aged woman making a deliberate choice to share her life with a specific person, on terms that reflected who she already was rather than who she was still becoming. David N. Swansea was a resident of the Keystone area, a man established in the Black Hills community that Carrie had come to call home. He was a widower with children from his previous marriage, which means that Carrie, in marrying him, was not simply gaining a husband. She was gaining a ready-made family. She was walking into a household that already had its own history, its own rhythms, its own grief, and its own children who needed a woman to be present for them in the ways that daily life demands. The books have no chapter for this. Laura's Little House series ends long before 1912. The Carrie who appears in those pages is a child, a young girl, a figure seen through the eyes of an older sister who was herself still becoming. The Carrie who married David Swansea was none of those things. She was a woman in her 40s, with decades of work experience behind her, with a body she had learned to manage and negotiate across multiple climates, with a name she was about to legally exchange for another. Carrie Ingalls became Carrie Ingalls Swansea. That is a legal and social fact. But it is also something else, a quiet marker of transformation that the historical record tends to skip past too quickly. When a woman's name changes in a courthouse record, what changes with it? What does the new name carry? What does it leave behind? In Carrie's case, the new name did not erase the Ingalls identity. She carried both names into old age, and she remained in contact with her family, particularly with Laura, throughout the rest of her life. But the Swansea name marks something real. A new household, a new set of daily responsibilities, a new primary relationship, and a life whose centre of gravity had shifted away from de Smet and the family story into something that belonged, first and most practically, to the Black Hills. Here is a thing that historical biography tends to handle carelessly: stepmotherhood. When biographers mention that Carrie helped raise David Swansea's children, the phrase slides by quickly, as if it were a minor footnote to the more interesting story of a famous author's quiet sister. But stepmotherhood is not a footnote. It is relentless daily life. It is meals and illnesses and school years and personalities and the patient, unromantic work of being responsible for children who did not start out as yours. Carrie Ingalls Swansea walked into that responsibility at 42 years old, with a body that had spent decades negotiating its own demands in a mining region town in the Black Hills, without a script for how it was supposed to go. The record does not give us the specific names or ages of David Swansea's children at the time of the marriage with complete clarity. Biographical summaries confirm the existence of the stepfamily without providing the granular domestic detail that would let a historian reconstruct every year. What the record does make clear is that Carrie was present, that she was part of this household, that she was not simply a boarder who happened to share a last name with the man who owned the house. Carrie was no longer being carried by the family story. She was carrying a life. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment before anything else follows. The Ingalls children had been carried away by Pa's decisions, by Ma's endurance, by the particular shape of a frontier childhood that required everyone to contribute and no one to ask for too much in return. The family story had always been larger than any individual inside it. Now, in the Black Hills, in a household with a husband and stepchildren, and a climate that suited her lungs, Carrie was the axis. She was the one others organised around. She was not the frail child in the corner. She was the woman in the middle of a functioning adult life. Accountability is its own kind of strength. It does not announce itself. It does not receive a book deal. It simply shows up every morning and handles what the day requires. The Little House books are, at their structural core, a childhood memoir. They follow a family through a specific period of years, filtered through a narrator who was herself still a child for most of the events described. The form of the books, their emotional logic, their narrative shape, their sense of what matters and what passes by, is built around childhood perception. That is not a criticism. It is a description, and it means that every person in those books exists primarily as they appeared to a child named Laura Ingalls who was watching them. Mary appears as the older sister, the good one, the one who went blind. Ma appears as the steady centre, the calico dress, the domestic anchor. Pa appears as the risk-taker, the fiddle player, the man who loved a wide horizon more than a settled town. And Carrie appears as the small one, the younger one, the one who was always slightly behind and slightly less certain than the others. That version of Carrie is historically real. It was not invented. But it is also incomplete in the way that all childhood perception is incomplete, because children see the people around them as they appear at that specific moment. not as the full arc of a human life will eventually reveal them to be. The Carrie who appears in Laura's books was 7, 10, 12 years old. The books could not follow her into 42, into Keystone, into a courthouse marriage record, into the daily life of a Black Hill stepfamily, because the books were not written to follow anyone that far. Laura's frame was childhood. Carrie's life refused to end there. This is not about Laura failing her sister. Laura and Carrie maintained a close relationship throughout their adult lives. There is no evidence, none, that Laura deliberately diminished Carrie's story or excluded her adult life with anything other than the natural editorial logic of writing a childhood memoir. The frame was not malicious, but the frame was limited, and the limitation meant that the Carrie who existed after the books ended, the Carrie of Keystone, of the Swansea household, of the Black Hills, became, for most readers, essentially invisible. The further Carrie moved from the page, the more real she became. By the time Mount Rushmore's carving began in 1927, Carrie had already been a Keystone resident for years. The transformation of the landscape around her, the mountain being carved into a national monument, the tourists beginning to arrive, the Black Hills economy shifting towards something new, was happening in the background of her ordinary days. She was in her late 50s. She had outlived the long winter, the grasshopper years, the failed claims, the thin prairie margins, and the difficult decade of caregiving inside the Smet household. She had worked in journalism at a time when female typesetters were not particularly common. She had moved across state lines, found a climate that suited her body, built a community life in a mining region town, married a widower, and helped raise children who needed her. And the books had no chapter for any of them. The Black Hills did not ask Carrie to be anyone's sister. They did not ask her to stand slightly behind the person next to her. Useful, but unnamed. The Black Hills were simply where she lived, where she bought groceries and knew her neighbours and negotiated the mountain winter, and watched a national monument being carved out of granite a few miles away, as if the landscape itself were being rewritten into something permanent. Carrie had spent her childhood watching Pa try to write something permanent on the land. The claims failed, the crops failed, the houses were abandoned, the names didn't always stick. In Keystone, hers did. Here is the quiet distortion that the historical record perpetuates every time it mentions Carrie Ingalls. It uses the maiden name, Carrie Ingalls, Laura's sister Carrie, the frail one, the overlooked one, always identified backward, always identified through her family of origin, always described in terms of the name she had before her life really started to belong to her. But Carrie spent 34 years as Carrie Ingalls Swansea, from 1912 until her death in 1946. She carried that name through World War I, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and World War II. It was not a final label passed on to the end of her life. It was the name of her long adult chapter. She was a Swansea through the deaths of her parents, the deaths of her siblings, the long, slow process of watching the Little House mythology grow into something that consumed the family's public identity, even as the actual family members aged and struggled and changed. She was Carrie Swansea, and history keeps calling her Carrie Ingalls. That is not a small mistake. Every time the historical record pulls her back to the maiden name, it is in effect pulling her back to the child she was in Laura's books, the frail child, the small child, the one who existed primarily in relation to the family story rather than in her own right. Every time a biographer writes Carrie Ingalls, Laura's sister, instead of Carrie Ingalls Swansea, a woman who lived for 34 adult years under a different name in the Black Hills, a small reduction happens. A woman's actual life gets compressed back into a childhood frame that she herself had already left behind. The new name was not a rejection of the Ingalls identity. It was an addition to it. Carrie carried both. But the Swansea half, the adult half, the household responsible half, the Black Hills half, keeps getting lost. Think carefully about what the timeline of Carrie's adult life actually contained. She was 42 when she married. She was in her mid to late 50s when the Great Depression arrived and collapsed the American economy around everyone who lived in it. She was in her late 60s when World War II began. She would die in Rapid City in 1946, having outlived Pa, Ma, Mary, Grace, and the brother Freddie she barely had time to know. Having outlived nearly everyone the childhood story was built around except Laura. The Depression hit the Black Hills the way it hit everywhere in America. hard, prolonged, and without mercy for those who had built modest lives rather than wealthy ones. There is no particular reason to believe that Carrie and David Swansea's household was insulated from the economic pressure of the 1930s. The record does not describe them as wealthy. Keystone's mining economy was not immune to the general collapse. Carrie was already in her 60s during the Depression years. She had lived through enough collapses to know what one felt like from the inside. She knew what it was to watch a year's work disappear. She knew what it was to hold a household together when the numbers did not add up. She had watched Pa hold households together under exactly those conditions year after year on the Dakota Prairie. She had watched Ma hold households together even harder, and now she was the one in the middle of the house, and the arithmetic was not easy, and nobody was writing it down. The books had no room for this. The books were finished. By the end of Carrie Ingalls Swansea's life in 1946, the Little House books had already become an American institution. Laura Ingalls Wilder was famous. The frontier story, the brave family, the hardship endured with grace, the pioneer spirit that became mythology, had been sealed and polished and handed to generations of children as a story about what American grit looked like. Carrie had lived through every single year that Laura wrote about. She had been in those rooms, in those winters, on those claims. She would have carried her own memories of those same rooms, winters, and claims, because every person inside a family story remembers from a different angle. The public record does not preserve Carrie correcting Laura, complaining about her portrayal, or turning the books into a public quarrel. What it does preserve is quieter. Carrie had also built a whole life the books never touched, but she had also built a whole life that the books never touched. That life, the adult woman, the Black Hills resident, the wife, the stepmother, the community member, the person who outlived the story, is what the final chapter of this documentary must restore to full view. The Little House books could only keep Carrie young. Keystone did not. In the Black Hills, she was no longer the small sister at the edge of Laura's memory, the one the eye skipped past, the one whose name appeared and disappeared without weight. She was a woman with a changed name, a functioning household, a body she'd spent a lifetime negotiating with, and a life that had moved so far beyond the page that the page could not find her anymore. Chapter 7 will follow her to the end. Not as a footnote, not as a frail child given a final paragraph out of obligation, but as a woman who carried more than the books ever showed, and who, for 3 decades in the Black Hills, was known by a different name than the one history keeps reaching for. Carrie Swansea. She earned that name. She lived inside it for 34 years. It is past time the record used it. By the time Carrie Swansea reached the last years of her life, the world had finally learned Laura's name. Not just learned it, celebrated it. The Little House books were in schools, in libraries, in the hands of girls who had never seen a prairie and never would. Laura Ingalls Wilder had become something larger than a person by then. She had become an American memory, a version of the frontier that felt true because it felt earned, because it was told from the inside, in a voice that never stopped loving what it described. And Carrie Swansea lived long enough to see those books enter the world. She was in them after all. She was the smaller one, the quieter one, the one who needed to be carried sometimes and who watched from behind when the bigger moments happened. She was little Carrie, preserved in amber at an age that no longer existed, tucked into a story that had already decided what she was. The woman living while those pages entered the world was in her 60s and 70s. That distance between the child fixed in the pages and the adult woman still living beyond them is not a wound the record confirms. We cannot say what Carrie privately thought about seeing her younger self preserved there. We cannot claim she felt erased, or grateful, or indifferent. The record does not preserve her interior. What we can say is this: the books kept her young. Life did not. Fame does something particular to the people around famous people. It does not erase them. It fixes them. It takes a living, complicated human being and assigns them a role, and then it keeps assigning that same role, decade after decade, until the role becomes the only thing anyone reaches for when they say the name. Laura Ingalls. Wilder's fame rose steadily through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Little House in the Big Woods came out in 1932. Little House on the Prairie followed in 1935. By the time These Happy Golden Years was published in 1943, Laura was an established American literary figure, reviewed, celebrated, given awards, written about in newspapers that Carrie would have known how to set in type herself, and in every account of Laura's achievement, the same cast of characters appeared. Pa, with his fiddle and his restless heart. Ma, steady and dignified, always managing. Mary, the beautiful blind sister who inspired Laura's sacrifice. Grace, sweet and golden. And Carrie, little Carrie, frail Carrie, the one who cried on the schoolhouse steps, the one who needed help. Every telling of the Little House story pulled Carrie backward in time. Every review, every interview, every admiring article about Laura's pioneer girlhood made the same unconscious decision. Carrie was the child in the books, and the child in the books was all Carrie was. The woman in Keystone, South Dakota, who had buried a husband, helped raise children that were not hers by birth, navigated a mining town economy, and carried the weight of a life that no book had ever recorded. She did not appear in those accounts. She was not hidden. She was simply never looked for. There is a particular kind of historical silence that is easy to mistake for absence. Carrie Ingalls Swansea left no memoir. No diary has surfaced that records her private reckoning with Laura's fame, or with the way the books rendered her. No letters exist, at least none that the public record preserves, in which she described what it felt like to be known only in the version of herself that ended before adulthood began. We do not need to invent her feelings to see the problem. The problem is visible in the way history kept naming her. Look through the quick references and family summaries that shaped public memory of the Ingalls family. Carrie is usually reduced to the same narrow facts. The year she was born, her relationship to Laura, and the word frail. Not the woman who moved beyond to Smet and built an adult life in the Black Hills. Not the woman who set type in a South Dakota newspaper. Not the woman who married David Swansea in 1912 and took on a family midlife. Not the woman who outlived Pa, Ma, Mary, Grace, Freddie, and her husband David, and still kept going. Just Frail, born 1870, Laura's sister. We do not have to invent grief to call that a failure of historical imagination. Carrie Ingalls. Swansea lived long enough to become one of the last living witnesses to a world that millions of Americans believed they understood. Think about what that means, not abstractly, but as a physical experience of time. By the 1940s, almost everyone she had shared that original world with was gone. Charles Ingalls, Pa, the man with the fiddle and the impossible faith in the next horizon, died in 1902. Carrie was 31 years old. The man who had carried her and named her and moved the family 6 times across the middle of the continent was gone before the 20th century had properly started. Caroline Ingalls, Ma, the quiet spine of every household they built, died in 1924. By then, Carrie had already been in the Black Hills for over a decade. By then, the whole Prairie chapter of her life was already 20 years behind her. Mary Ingalls, who had lived long and inwardly after losing her sight, died in 1928. Grace Ingalls Dow, the younger sister, the golden-haired one, died in 1941, just 5 years before Carrie herself. And David Swansea, Carrie's husband, the man she had built her adult life beside, died in 1928 as well. By 1941, Carrie Ingalls Swansea had outlived Mary, Grace, Freddie, Pa, Ma, and David. Sit with that for a moment. She was not the last Ingalls sibling, Laura was still alive, but Carrie had become one of the last living witnesses to the family world the books had made famous. She was the last living person who had eaten at that table, slept in those houses, heard Pa's fiddle in an actual room with actual firelight. She was the last one who could say, "I was there, and it was not what the books decided it was, and it was not only what the books decided it was, and the people in those pages were not only what the pages said they were." She carried that knowledge alone for the last 5 years of her life. History never asked her for it. Let us be careful here, because this is where it would be easy to go wrong. Laura Ingalls. Wilder was not Carrie's enemy. The Little House books were not an act of erasure. They were an act of love, imperfect, selective, shaped by memory and audience and the particular demands of children's literature, but love nonetheless. Laura wrote about Carrie warmly. She wrote about her protectively. In the books, there is no contempt in the way Carrie is described. There is tenderness, even a kind of fierce older sister pride in the moments when Carrie proves she is stronger than she looks. The problem was never Laura's intention. The problem was the way fame calcifies intention into permanence. Laura got to write the story first. She got to choose the frame. And once the frame became famous, it became the only frame most people ever reached for. That is not a crime. It is how myth works. It is how any story powerful enough to become a cultural touchstone works. It absorbs the people inside it, fixes them in place, and keeps them there long after those people have moved on, and changed, and grown into someone the story never accounted for. Laura became a legend, which is a kind of gift. Carrie became a legend's little sister, which is a kind of limitation. There is a difference between the two, and that difference does not require anyone to be a villain. Fame answers one question very well. Was this person here? It answers almost no other questions honestly. It cannot tell you whether the person in the famous story recognized themselves in it. It cannot tell you what they carried privately that the story never found. It cannot tell you who they became after the story ended, what skills they built, what losses they absorbed, what version of themselves they offered the world when no one with a pen was paying attention. By the 1940s, Laura Ingalls Wilder had answered the question, was Carrie here? Very thoroughly. Yes, Carrie was here. She was in the big woods. She was on the prairie. She was in the long winter. She was on the schoolhouse steps. She was in the family, always present, always the smaller one, always being helped or protected or carried a little further than she could have walked alone. But the question fame cannot answer, the question that matters more now, is this. Who was Carrie after the story stopped? And that question has only one honest answer. We have to look past the frame to find out. There is something the historical record gives us, even when it gives us very little. It gives us duration. Caroline Celestia Ingalls Swansea was born August 3rd, 1870, in Montgomery County, Kansas, and she lived until June 2nd, 1946. That is 75 years. 75 years is not a footnote. It is not a minor character's lifespan. It is not the biography of someone who existed only to fill a supporting role in someone else's story. 75 years means she was alive during the Civil War's last aftermath and the first nuclear age. It means she lived through the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era and the Great War and the Depression and the Second World War. It means she watched the frontier she grew up on become the nostalgic mythology she was eventually written into. It means she was a woman in motion through an enormous amount of American history, most of which had nothing to do with Puss Fiddle or Laura's pen. We do not always have the detail we want. We know she worked. We know she stayed in the Black Hills after David died. We know she was part of a community, embedded in the rhythms of a place she had chosen rather than been moved to by someone else's restlessness. But even without the detail, the duration stands. 75 years of choosing to continue is its own kind of answer to every story that called her limited. June 2nd, 1946. Carrie Ingalls Swansea died in Rapid City, South Dakota on June 2nd, 1946. She was 75 years old. The date is quiet. The record is spare. We do not have the room she was in. We do not have who sat beside her. We do not have final words because the record does not give us final words, and this documentary will not invent them. What we have is the date, and the place, South Dakota, where she had chosen to remain for decades, long after she could have left, long after the Black Hills chapter of her life had cost her a husband and the full weight of an unsupported later life. She stayed. That is not a small thing. The people in Laura's books were always moving. Carrie was the one who stopped moving and stayed. Laura Ingalls Wilder outlived Carrie by more than a decade. Laura died on February 10th, 1957, at 90 years old. By the time Laura died, Carrie was already gone. With Laura's death, the last surviving Ingalls sibling closed the chapter. History did not forget Carrie Ingalls Swansea. That is actually the more complicated problem. If history had simply forgotten her, the correction would be straightforward. Find the evidence, introduce the woman, restore the biography. Done. But history did not forget her. History remembered her incorrectly. It remembered her in a fixed, limited, permanently childhood version that the books had created and fame had sealed. It kept pulling her backward. Every time a new generation encountered Little House, they encountered little Carrie, the frail one, the one who got carried, the one who cried on the steps, and that version was allowed to stand as complete, because why would you look further? That is a harder problem to correct because it requires more than adding information. It requires changing the angle of attention. It requires asking, what happened after the frame? The answer, the documented, restrained, historically careful answer, is that a full adult life happened. Work happened, migration happened, marriage happened, responsibility happened, loss happened, survival happened. Decades of ordinary, unremarkable, genuinely human experience happened. Most of it unrecorded, all of it real. The mistake was not that history ignored Carrie. The mistake was that it remembered her too small and then never looked up. Early in this documentary, we introduced an image, a farm ledger, 2 columns, the left side for what a life contained, the actual years, the actual choices, the actual ground covered, the right side for what history recorded. For the Ingalls family, those 2 columns were rarely the same width. For Carrie Ingalls Swansea, the right column was very short. Born, Frail, Laura's sister, died. The left column took 75 years to fill, and most of what went into it was never written down by anyone whose words survived. That imbalance is not a reason for outrage. It is a reason for honesty. It is a reason to look at the right column and say plainly, this is too small. This is not what the left side looked like. This is not the whole account. The ledger is not closed by adding drama or invention. It is closed by restoring the correct name to the correct entry and refusing to let the short column stand as the final word. Her name was Caroline Celestia Ingalls Swansea. Not just Carrie, not just Laura's little sister, not just the frail one who needed help on the schoolhouse steps in a book that came out in 1940. Caroline Celestia Ingalls Swansea. She was born in Kansas, raised on a series of frontiers that did not always survive the season, educated in a one-room schoolhouse, employed in newspaper work, homesteaded by preemption in South Dakota, settled in the Black Hills, married in middle age, became part of a stepfamily, was widowed, and lived a life that extended decades beyond the last page of the books that kept her young. She was, by any honest measure, a person of quiet and considerable endurance. An endurance, not fame, not legend, not even a book with her name in the title, is what the left column of her ledger actually records. She was not remarkable in the way her sister became remarkable. She did not leave behind a series of beloved novels. She did not give American children a version of the frontier they could carry into their own lives and call their own. But she was not an afterthought to herself. That is the correction history owes her. Not pity, not elevated legend, not a rival mythology that crowns her in place of Laura. Just the acknowledgement that the woman who outlived the frame was real and full and more than the frame ever held. Go back to the photograph. You know the one. The family gathered, the faces turned toward the camera, the story already beginning to arrange itself around the figure you were trained to follow first. At the beginning of this documentary, there was a figure your eye kept skipping. Not Laura, not Mary, not Pa, the smaller one, the one you almost moved past. You know more now. You know that the smaller figure in the photograph was not defined by her size. You know that the word frail was a medical observation that got promoted to a life sentence by the carelessness of history. You know that the girl in that photograph grew up and moved beyond Smet into a Black Hills community and worked a job that required precision and stamina and showed up every day. You know she made choices in her own name. You know she made a life that no book followed and no legend claimed. Look at her again. Not with the eye you had before this documentary, with the eye that knows what came after. She is not small in that photograph. She is early. She's still at the beginning of a 75-year life that the story around her never had the room, or the intention, or the time to tell. The frame was the limitation, not her. Just some people are remembered accurately. Some are remembered partially, which feels complete until you look closely. Carrie Ingalls Swansea was remembered partially. History took the part that fit inside a beloved children's book and called it the whole. It took the child and forgot to follow her out the door and into the decades that came after. The real decades, the heavy ones, the ones that required more from her than any winter in the books ever documented. She did not need to be famous to be whole. She was whole. The mistake was ours, the readers, the reviewers, the cultural memory that kept reaching for the easiest version of a person and calling it sufficient. Memory is not the same as justice, but remembering correctly, remembering fully, slowly, with both columns of the ledger open, is the closest thing we have. Her name was Caroline Celestia Ingalls Swansea. She lived 75 years. She was frail, yes, but that was never the measure.